In less than 6 months, Black Flag would return to the East Coast. During this time, Henry had been in contact with Chuck Dukowski. Chuck had given Henry a cassette tape of unreleased demo recordings, which Henry listened to daily. How Henry joined the band, I'll let him tell you.
They played in New York. I was in Washington. I took a ride up to go see them because they weren't coming down to my town. I jumped on stage and sang with them that night, a song, because I had to go back down to D.C. and go work like some awful shift. They called me a few days later at the ice cream store and said, we're looking for a singer because the rhythm guitar player wants to, the vocalist wants to move down to rhythm guitar. You can tell I've told the story before. And we're holding auditions. You want to crack at this? Because we saw you on stage the other night. You're pretty wild. I looked at the ice cream scoop in my hand, my chocolate bespattered apron, and my future in the world of minimum wage work. Or I could go up to New York and audition for this crazy band who was my favorite. What's the worst that's going to happen to me? I miss a day of work. Ooh, there goes $21. And I get humiliated in front of my favorite band. And so I took a train up there. I walked into this practice place in the East Village. I'm standing there with the band with a microphone in my hand. They said, pick the tune. And I sang every song they had, improvising most of it. 2 times through, we did the set. They said, okay, you have a seat. We're going to go have a band meeting, whatever that means. And they came back like 10 minutes later, said, okay, you're in. I said, what do you mean? They said, you're the singer in Black Flag. I said, so what do I do? They go, you quit your job, you pack your gear, you meet us on the road. Here's the tour itinerary, here's the lyrics. We'll see you soon.
Henry caught up with the band in Detroit on July 14th, 1981. He would roadie for the rest of the tour and sing encores until they returned home to Los Angeles. It would only take one more night on the road for Henry to see firsthand what kind of violence Black Flag had become accustomed to. During the set, Chuck noticed a bouncer beating up a girl, so he hit the bouncer in the head with the head of his bass. The bouncer was rushed to the hospital. The club owner ended up calling other venues along Black Flag's route and told them not to pay the band. I began to actively work on a Black Flag documentary in 2006. By this time, more information was available on the band, so research became easier. I began gathering sources and creating an outline for the story. I also looked to see if I could find contact information for any of the members. I was able to successfully contact Keith Morris, Chuck Dukowski, Bill Stevenson, Henry Rollins, and documentary filmmaker David Markey. I also contacted a filmmaker who I will not mention by name, but they told me that they had actually attempted to make a Black Flag documentary film, but were unable to get Greg to agree to participate. Bill no longer lived in LA. Henry emphatically declined to participate, but Keith, Chuck, and David were all open to it. Knowing I was not going to have Henry or Greg's participation didn't make me want to stop at this point, but it did give me pause. Henry quickly learned what the police in LA thought of Black Flag. They arrived home to discover that their rehearsal space in Torrance had been shut down because the police believed that the band was part of a drug smuggling ring. Henry would begin to be followed to and from practice as well.
We were handing out flyers in front of the Palladium, which is this club it's a club, it's like a 5,000-seat theater. And I'm about to hand out more flyers, and all of a sudden, Chuck Dukowski, the bass player at the time, grabs my arm and throws me. I go flying through the air, flyers flying everywhere. This thing whizzes past my ear, like, Ew! I go ass over tea kettle onto the ground, bumping into this small retaining wall that blocks the sidewalk from the parking lot. I get up thinking, like, what the fuck was that about, man? I was just gonna hand out a flyer. Why did he throw me around like that? And what was that thing that passed my ear? I get up, it's a cop on a horse, going by me, just following through with his billy club. It went by my ear. I think it was aimed for right at the back of my head. And I felt it go by my ear. That shit was going fast. If that hit me in my head, my fucking brains would have come through my nose, you know?
A quick note on SST Records. SST was created by Greg in order to distribute the first Black Flag recording when no one else would. After a gig with the Minutemen, Greg approached them and asked them to join SST. The Minutemen were the first band to be signed by SST. Eventually, SST would also distribute records by The Descendants, The Subhumans, Husker Du, Sonic Youth, St. Vitus, Dinosaur Jr., and many, many more. The lasting impact on rock music, including the explosion of grunge music and pop punk of the 90s, can be directly linked to SST's groundbreaking albums or the fact that many people who started bands started because Black Flag was the first punk rock band to play in their town. To talk about the legacy of Black Flag, one must include the SST Records and vice versa.
This is your brain on corporate rock. Save your brain. Listen to these on SST, Husker Du, Firehose, Dinosaur Jr., Minutemen, Screaming Trees, HR, Sonic Youth, Grand Heart, Meat Puppets, Negative Land, No Man. Now, Soul of the Hard Line, Black Flag wasted again, Bad Brains, Eigenside, Descendants, All Soundgarden, Ultra Mega OK, Destroy Corporate Rock.
By any measure, SST was a small label. Two of its chief employees were Greg Ginn and Chuck Dukowski, who had to split their time between being in a band and working with other bands. Maybe the SST workload was getting to be too much. Maybe Greg felt that the band deserved a larger platform. Whatever the case may be, Greg decided to work with the in-house studio and label Unicorn Records for the recording and release of their first full-length album, Damaged. The album was recorded in October of 1981, produced by Spot and Black Flag. Damaged is an album that would essentially create what we now refer to as hardcore punk. It was a combination of their old set as well as new tracks. Unicorn had distribution through major label MCA, so an album with MCA behind it could mean more money, worldwide distribution, promotion, bigger venues, and more. At the time, there was barely any money to press the records for the band on SST, and the band was having trouble even buying food.
There's the Mexican restaurant across the street from Rod's, next to the 7-Eleven. We would go in, and I learned this from Dukowski. We would order like a bowl of chips and salsa, which is like, $1.35, and water. So the waiter knows that we're stiffs. So he grumbles and goes away. You wait for families or couples to be getting up from their meals to leave. Before the waiter can take the food they leave, you run over and either take the plate back to your table or you sit down at that table and you hoover up this already been chewed upon food, which the first time you do it, it's gross.
That's
disgusting. It's disgusting. But when you're hungry enough, you just like, I'm doing it.
Unicorn pressed 25,000 copies of Damage before the head of MCA, Al Bergamo, heard the album. MCA soon announced that it would not be distributing Black Flag's Damaged, as Bergamo found the album to be, quote, immoral and an anti-parent record. Unicorn made a deal with Pickwick to distribute, but there were 25,000 copies with the MCA logo still on it, so the band opted to cover the MCA logo on each copy with a simple sticker. The band set out on another tour in November of 1981 that would include their first European gigs. While England was a hotbed of punk rock music and post-punk, the band played to many hostile crowds and even hostile bands. They also had roadies steal their food, members of the crowd spit on them, and sometimes even worse, the crowd was just simply bored by them. On top of all that, Robo was stopped at the airport because of an expired visa and forced to fly back to Colombia. Even with a higher profile, the band was willing and often had to play anywhere for anyone.
I was playing in front of nobody but like two bouncers and a bartender and like two guys with mullets at the back. And I was getting copying an attitude. So I was like, here's a song if you give a. And Chuck Dukowski, the bass player, is on my stage left. He's coming and he runs into me like with his right shoulder, like wham, and flattens me. And I get up like a friendly hit me because I'm used to the audience hitting me.
Yeah.
And he looked at me. He said, "You never give less than 100% on this stage with this band." And I'm like, he only had to tell me that once.
However, just like Los Angeles, the band would run into problems with playing shows that were shut down by cops, club owners wouldn't pay them, bouncers breaking windows on the van, people stealing from the band. In one instance, when the van caught fire, and Chuck had to get underneath the van to put the fire out with a pillow before it destroyed all of their equipment. Unicorn was not paying Black Flag any royalties on Damage and not telling them what they sold. According to Joe Carducci, an employee at SST, Greg decided to let Unicorn know that they would consider their agreement with them void. In response, Unicorn filed an injunction against Black Flag that would keep them from recording or releasing any material under the Black Flag name. With no money coming from Damaged and being unable to record or release any more material, the band needed a way to keep afloat. According to Carducci, the band made a verbal agreement with Unicorn to release a compilation of previously recorded material but to leave off the band name. After releasing the material, Chuck and Greg were held in contempt of court and each had to spend a week in jail. Greg was able to bring on some legal help who would defray their legal costs until the case was settled, but a lot of the legwork had to be done by the band. While the court battle went on, Black Flag continued to tour everywhere, including a return trip to Europe, as well as host a couple of benefit shows to cover some of their legal expenses. The second benefit show would be at the biggest venue that they had ever played at, the Santa Monica Civic. The packed 3,000-seat venue would serve as a location for the first reunion of sorts for Black Flag. The band would bring back Ron Reyes, Des Cadena, and Merrill Ward would fill in as Keith Morris, and then close out the show with Henry. Unicorn filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. However, when they were caught violating the terms of this type of bankruptcy, they were forced to cease all operations, and Black Flag was released of all obligations to the label. While the lawsuit was going on, most members of Black Flag lived together at SST. With money and food being scarce, the band was playing more shows, touring more, practicing more, putting more effort into other bands' releases, and sleeping less. Chuck would later say that this period of time was, quote, tearing at the seams of the band. Greg's demand as the leader of the band would become more specific and more intense as he matured as a guitar player. Greg's demand as a guitarist would prompt him to ask Chuck Dukowski to leave the band, but to stay and help run SST. He would be replaced by Kira Rossler, a member of Des Cadena's band, DC3. After spending a significant amount of time researching and outlining a story and getting in touch with members of the band, I decided I wanted some face-to-face time with anyone that would meet with me. This would be in the hopes that this would lead to a more formal interview later on. I scheduled time to meet with Keith Morris, Chuck Dukowski, and documentary filmmaker David Markey. I spent 3 days on a bus traveling from Indiana to California and arrived in Los Angeles on January 2nd, 2007. I recorded my conversations with Keith and David, never intending to use the footage. Chuck was unfortunately unable to meet up once I got there, but I spoke with him on the phone later. He was open to the idea of a documentary on the band. 1984 would turn out to be possibly the most packed year for the band. Their tour would take them across the country as well as shows in Canada, Mexico, and Europe. The band would also release 3 albums in addition to other SST releases that year. The 3 Black Flag albums of 1984 would be My War, Family Man, and Slip It In. The 2-minute catchy songs from previous albums would be almost nowhere to be heard on any of these albums. The B-side of My War includes 3 songs that are more than 6 minutes. Family Man would be one side of Henry's spoken word material, and the other side was all instrumentals. The new material received backlash almost instantly when the band started playing it on tour. The band was playing songs the fans didn't know, that hadn't been released, and they were vastly different from the style the crowds had come to know. In addition to not sounding like a typical punk rock band anymore, none of the members looked like a typical punk rock band, which further angered some members of the audience.
One summer, Black Flag didn't cut we didn't cut our hair because we would get so much outrage from punk rock. What are you, hippie? Like, yeah, I'm a hippie now because I haven't cut my hair for a week and a half. Like, what? All of a sudden, this is an elitist group, and I rebelled against that so much. Where we would play a song that was like 4 whole minutes long. Like, what's up with that? Like, what do you mean, what's up with that? We're trying something. And I found these people to be, certainly not all of them, but by and large, I found them to be some of the most elitist, closed-minded people I had ever encountered. I'm back in high school with all these guys who were making fun of me. And I thought music is like the judgment-free zone. Right. In that if I don't like your band, I'm not showing up to the gig, but I'm not going to stand around and put you down.
Even within the band itself, there was a growing sense of divide between the different members. Emil had been pushed out shortly after joining. Chuck Dukowski was asked to leave. Bill Stevenson would get to a point where he wasn't getting along with Greg. Kira was kicked out of the band. Greg's growing frustration with the band would push him to start a side project band, an instrumental trio called Gone. Greg's waning attention may be no more evident than in the release of Black Flag's instrumental EP, explicitly calling out the immense changes going on right in its title, The Process of Weeding Out. The remaining time that Black Flag is together between 1984 and 1986 are variations on a routine: rehearse, record, and tour. Tension within the band was pushing them further apart to only work together as needed, and then turn their attention elsewhere. Greg was putting more attention into SST as they started making more money following the lawsuit. Henry had discovered that he had a knack for spoken word performances that would include reading poetry or telling stories, in addition to self-publishing a book of his writings. After my trip to Los Angeles, while I was overjoyed to have spoken with members of the band, I was convinced of two things. One, that I was wholly unprepared to make the film on my own, having almost no experience doing anything more than running a camera, let alone putting together a 90-minute narrative. And two, that Greg Ginn would never participate in a film about the band and may even prevent it from coming out. It's quite possible that several people knew that 1986 would be their last tour. Going on tour with Black Flag would be Gone and Painted Willie. The latter of the two bands included David Markey on drums, who was also a documentary filmmaker. Chuck Dukowski not only suggested that Markey record footage of the tour, but SST even bought film for it. The end result, Reality 86, would never see distribution. In January, as Henry noted in his journal, Greg said point blank to Henry that he did not like him. The remainder of the tour, the band plays the same set list every night, almost as if trying to survive until the end. The last show that Black Flag played was on June 27th in Detroit, the same city that Henry joined them on. In August, Henry would be visiting Washington, D.C. when Greg called him and ended the band. During their time as a band, Black Flag would see more than 15 members come and go, equipment break, engine failure, car accident, lawsuit, equipment stolen, no money, no food, police intimidation, police violence, crowd indifference, backlash to anything different, and a lot of good old-fashioned sleep deprivation. Black Flag's ultimate undoing was themselves, which is clearly the only way they were going to come to an end. The world gave them many reasons to stop, and yet they persevered. In doing so, they paved the way for new kinds of music and set the stage for the next generation of popular rock music. Ultimately, the real legacy of Black Flag lie in doing whatever was necessary to put their work out into the world. I had to come to terms with the fact that despite my research and my work and my excitement, that I was not ready to make the film, and it was not going to have an interview with the most important member of the band. That was enough for me to walk away from the project at the time. The next year I ended up attending college and then pursuing a career in video production. I had basically let go of the idea of ever telling Black Flag's story. Then something happened. At Irving Plaza, the same venue that Henry Rollins impulsively jumped on stage and altered the course of his life forever, former members of Black Flag, including Keith Morris, Chuck Dukowski, Des Cadena, and Bill Stevenson, returned to perform. I was there in the crowd, standing probably not far from where Henry stood, wondering why I had decided to walk away from the project that I was so passionate about. It became obvious to me that the band's legacy is not fading, but as new generations are discovering the music and hearing the story, they are becoming inspired all over again. I decided that day that I would get the project done, somehow, some way, by any means, because that's what Black Flag would have done.
My reaction won't take no more, no more, no more, no more, no more, no more, no.
And nothing comes to him who waits, really. And so I wrote the song about them, to say, hey, come on, Don't just sit there. Get up and do something. If you believe in something, tell somebody, vote for somebody, carry a placard, do something. Don't just sit there.